In the opening minutes of a 2008 home and away game between Geelong and Fremantle, Cameron Ling, who had handballed the ball, was met with a late elbow by Fremantle's Dean Solomon. At the time of the hit, the commentators and those watching at home were none the wiser, until it was seen that Ling would not be getting back up. On replay, Solomon was going for a bump, but would shockingly aim his elbow at Ling's chin, causing the horrific incident. Ling would miss multiple weeks with a fractured cheekbone, and Solomon would be dealt a hefty 8-week penalty for the hit. However, Solomon was aware of what he had done and would front the media to publicly apologise to Ling. Over 95% of you legends are not subscribed, so please make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. It helps out the channel a lot. In one of the more weird and somewhat funny series of events, in round 7 of the 1994 season, Peter Caven, who was a defender for the Sydney Swans, fell victim to a vicious elbow from Tony Lockett. Lockett would be dealt 8 weeks for the obvious intentional hit, and Caven would break his cheekbone and miss 12 weeks. Where this becomes quite interesting is when Caven would appear on the comedy television show Denton. Caven would bash a life-sized model of Lockett with a baseball bat, and it was Caven who was forced to apologise to Lockett a week after he was injured by Lockett. A year later, the two would become teammates at Sydney, and Caven would not find the same form as he had prior to the hit. He was dropped from Sydney after 9 games, and with the football manager telling him he wasn't good enough to play AFL football. However, Caven would be picked up by the Adelaide Crows and be an important player in defence and crucial in their back-to-back premiership wins. In 2002, two-time premiership captain Mark Bickley for the Crows would receive a 5-match ban for striking Darryl Wakelin of Port Adelaide and knocking him out in the line of play. While Bickley missed the remainder of the season, Wakelin would miss multiple weeks after requiring a bone graft and an insertion of metal plates to his face. He would return for the preliminary final for Port Adelaide, but they would lose to the eventual premiers Brisbane. Almost 15 years later, Bickley would recount the incident and a confrontation he had with Mark Williams, who was the coach for the Port Adelaide Power back then. Williams would confess that he believed Bickley's hit had cost Port Adelaide the 2002 premiership, due to how important Wakelin was to the team at the time, and that he never was able to get back to his best after returning from that injury. Adelaide would suffer without the veteran Bickley, as they would also lose to Collingwood in the preliminary final. Had Adelaide won, Bickley would have been available for the grand final. In the opening seconds of the 2006 elimination final between the Bulldogs and the Magpies, as the ball was being contested in the middle, a rampaging Brodie Holland would race from the wing and steamroll right into Brent Montgomery of the Bulldogs, knocking him out stiff. In today's game, if you looked at the state of Montgomery, he'd be subbed off and his season would have been over. However, he would stay in play and go on to kick the first goal of the game, and then kick 4 overall, helping the Dogs to victory. Holland would challenge the hit at the tribunal and have his initial 5-week offer raised to a 6-week suspension. In 2017, Holland revisited the incident and claimed his intentions were to stop Montgomery as he saw that the Bulldog player was searching for someone to run through. In round 14 of the 2018 season, between GWS and Brisbane, Brisbane's Harris Andrews would be running courageously with the flight of the footy and connect with the spoil. However, Jeremy Cameron of GWS, running the opposite direction and making absolutely no attempt at the ball, would connect his left elbow with Andrews' head, knocking the defender out cold. Harris would have bleeding in the brain as a result of the hit and miss a month of football with a serious concussion. A remorseful Jeremy Cameron would receive a 5-week ban from the game and admit to needing to reevaluate how he attacks the footy in a game. He has not faced suspension since. 2 years earlier, Cameron would be dealt a 4-week suspension for this bump on Brisbane defender Reece Matheson. The line in the sand match was a round 11 2004 clash between Hawthorn and Essendon that saw a huge brawl erupt between the two teams. Dermot Brereton, who was involved in Hawthorn's coaching team at the time, urged the players to take a stand against the intimidation of Essendon. The aftermath of that brawl saw 18 players from both teams, half the players on the field, being charged. Many of those involved were fined mainly. However, Essendon's Justin Murphy received 1 match for headbutting Hawthorn's Simon Beaumont, who would also get a week for his involvement. Hawthorn's Campbell Brown and Lance Picciane would get 4 weeks for striking, and Richard Vandenberg, who was the most involved in the incident, would be dealt a total of 6 weeks for striking and kneeing Adam McPhee, on top of a $4,000 fine. In 1985, Lee Matthews for the Hawks seemingly struck Neville Bruns from the Cats behind play, knocking the Cat out and causing him to miss 5 weeks of football. Matthews was deregistered for a month and would not only miss football, but be formally charged by the Victorian Police and convicted, having been sentenced to pay a $1,000 fine. However, the conviction was overturned, and Matthews instead had to serve a 12-month good behaviour bond. The derby between West Coast and Fremantle are notoriously heated contests between the two state rivals. But in the year 2000, to what is known now as the Demolition Derby, the two teams would engage in various brawls, with Dale Kickett of the Fremantle Dockers being the most involved. Kickett would be pinged for 3 separate striking charges and suspended for 9 matches total, and the fallout after the game would affect him mentally due to the public perception of him as a dirty player since. Robert Muir played 68 VFL games for St Kilda between 1974 and 1984, and is regarded as a brilliant player who was notorious for angry outbursts on the field, often in response to vicious racial abuse by both opposition fans and on-field players. In a match against Carlton in 1984, Muir would have multiple outbursts during the match against umpires and opponent players. His outbursts would result in a 12-week suspension. Muir defended his actions as provocation by the opponent players and supporters, who he claimed were hurling racial insults to him. Nonetheless, the suspension stood, and that would be the last time Muir played in the VFL. John Greening played for Collingwood in the 1970s. At the time, he was a promising young midfielder who could compete in the contests, on the ground and in the air. In round 14 of the 1972 season, Collingwood would face off against St Kilda, and the two sides were favourites to make the finals that year. In the early minutes of the game, Greening would take a mark and dispose of the footy to Peter McKenna. Shortly after, the 21-year-old Greening would be found motionless on the field, with blood coming out of his mouth. The spectators at attendance were shocked, and it was later found out that St Kilda's Jim O'Dea had left the young magpie with a cerebral concussion, of which he would take 6 months to recover from, being put in a comatose state for 24 hours. There were allegations that Jim O'Dea was under instruction of Alan Jeans, the coach then, to fix up Greening early in the game and to wipe him off from competing early on in the match. O'Dea would receive a 10-week suspension, but Greening would not return to football for another 2 years and only play another 9 games before he called time on his career. Thanks to everyone who commented on my last suspension video with their suggestions. If you have any other suggestions or want to give me a comment, please do so. I love interacting with you all, and make sure you hit that subscribe button, and let's try to get this video to 200 likes.